it's very pertinent. And the questions that I want to try and ask and answer today is it better to pray in Hebrew, even without understanding the words, or is it better to pray in a language which one understands? And that makes the assumption that it is permissible to pray in a language other than Hebrew, which we need to find the answer to. And the question really hinges to a certain extent on whether prayer is about content, in which case one of course has to understand what you're saying, or whether it's about a formula. There's something about the words in Hebrew which are so magical, so holy, whatever, so formulaic. They do all the things they need to do, even if you don't have a clue about what you're saying. But after all, you're saying it in Lashon HaKodesh. So that's the issue over there. Are there prayers to pray in English? Are there some prayers which you have to say in Hebrew? And we'll also want to look at the question of whether one can pray, not just possibly without understanding what you're saying, or even understanding what you're saying, but not being mindful at all. In other words, you've said the prayers, you haven't thought about it, there hasn't been any concentration whatsoever. It's just habitual, and you said what you had to say. Did it work? Does it count as prayer? So I don't want today to look at the issues of what is prayer and that whole discussion, and what is the meaning of prayer? Why do we pray? That's a different discussion altogether. I want to confine it to some of these slightly narrow issues that I've just outlined. And the way in which we're going to try and deal with this in the few minutes that we spend together on Fridays is by first of all going back, as always, to source, which means going back to the Talmud. And then, although there will be many steps in between in the early and the later commentaries, we will move straight to the finality of the law as it's expressed in the Shulchan Aruch, in the codes of law. And we'll look at an article by from a rabbi who's one of the Rosh Yeshivas in Yeshivat Gush in Israel, in which he discusses some of these. And then hopefully by the end, if you're going to stay with me all the way, we will come to some conclusions and you'll find the actual answers. I should say, by the way, that as always in these discussions, by the time you really get into the Talmud and into the early and the later commentaries, they do get really quite, pernickety. There's a forensic questioning, about every tiny little detail, and it gets a bit complicated. Our purpose over here is to try and keep it as simple as possible, and as a consequence, there may be some elements of it that I'm kind of like leaving out, etc., for the sake of working our way through to the answers without getting completely and totally confused. This is not a guide, an exercise in being a guide to the perplexed. It's more about just trying to understand. Now, I believe that you're all on mute, but in such a way that if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself either by pressing unmute or by holding down your space bar for the duration of which you'll be unmuted until you take your finger off it again. So we're going to go to our share screen, and the first screen we're going to go to is the page of Talmud. Just going to go to the top of where I want to be. And we are looking at the tractate of Sotah. And this is the 7th chapter. There are 9 chapters in this Talmud, in this tractate. This is the 7th. And the Mishnah starts as follows. These are recited in any language, not specifically in Hebrew. And this, of course, is the topic of this Talmud, the warning oath which is administered by a priest to a woman suspected by a husband of being unfaithful, etc. The declaration of tithes, and then we discover as well that the things which can be recited in any language are the Shema, the Amidah, and grace after meals. By the way, when we talk about prayer, we're talking about the Amidah. That is the core and the essence of prayer. Everything else was added by the rabbis subsequently. So we're not talking here about, the other parts of prayer that have been built up in our prayer service. The Shema is a biblical obligation. The Amidah was formulated by the sages to be our prayer. And the grace after meals, the reason why that's being mentioned over here is because that also is in the Torah. V'achalta, v'savata, u'verachta, says the Torah. When you eat and you're satisfied, then you shall bless. So it is a biblical commandment to do grace after meals as well, at least part of it. Okay. So these are recited in any language. Again, in terms of the forensic investigation, the questions which will be later asked in the Talmud, what does this really mean? You'll see over here a couple of notes on the side, which we'll look at. We'll look at the first one over here. This is from the Steinsaltz Koran edition once again. These are recited. So the Tosafot asks why this list only, why the author of the Mishnah only lists some of the examples that fall in this category, leaving out others. And the answer is that in accordance with their version of the Mishnah statement is that these are recited not in any language, but Tosafot actually had a different edition of this Mishnah. And their edition said these are recited in your own language, as opposed to in any language. And explain, therefore, that this refers specifically to those recitations that must be in a language which is your own, in other words, the one that you understand. And that excludes, therefore, recitations that may be recited in any language, but not because it's an imperative to understand the text. So the difference between these two, very small difference in terms of language. These are recited in your own language as opposed to these are recited in any language, is that in your own language means that you have to understand it. Any language means, am I allowed to read it in Persian, even though I don't understand what I'm saying? I can say it in any language, that's what the Mishnah says. But my own language means I have to understand what I'm saying. And this highlighted piece above here, in any language, once again, this is the version of Rashi, and Tosafot and the Jerusalem Talmud have this different version that I've just mentioned in their own language. And Tosafot say that the objection they have to this over here is, as I've just explained, that Rashi's version indicates that it doesn't matter what language is used, whereas the version that states in their own language implies it must be a language which is understood by the one speaking it. And Rashi agrees actually that one must understand it, but he simply wants to say that the novel element of this halacha is that there's no requirement for the statements to be recited in Hebrew. By the way, this begs a question as well. When we say that these can be recited in any language, what does it say about the rest? Does that mean that the rest can also be recited in any language? Or does it mean that the rest have to be in Hebrew? But by the way, these can be in English. That's the kind of question which the sages will ask about the language of the Mishnah. And we'll find out some of the answers to that. I want to move down through the Talmudic discussions over here, and you'll be glad to learn that we're not going to be going through all of these pages until we find a little bit more highlighting further down, when there's a nice picture of a sheep with a big fat tail, and we come back to the subject of the Shema, and we learn over here that the sages taught in the name of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who, by the way, is the author of the Mishnah, that the Shema must be recited in Hebrew, as it is written. And that is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And the rabbis disagreed with him amongst the rest of the rabbis, who were the majority, and they said it may be recited in any language. So we have a Talmudic dispute over here as to whether it has to be in Hebrew, which is the opinion of one person, but a very authoritative person, and the majority of the others who say that no, it can be in any language, and we'll eventually find out which one of them actually finds their way through to the final halacha. And a little bit further down, in relation to the Amidah, it is stated in the Mishnah that the Amidah prayer may be recited in any language. Tefillah, looking at the Hebrew over here, Rachamehi, The word rachamim, of course, is from rachamim. And it's a request for divine mercy. Kol heichid ba'e mitzaleh. That's anybody who wants to, anybody who needs to, may therefore pray in any way that one desires. So here we seem to have a statement which is universally accepted. Nobody's disagreeing with this, unlike the question of the Shema, and says that you can say it in any language, and the reason for that is because it is a request for divine mercy. And therefore you have to be able to say it in the way you want to say it. Once again, this begs a number of questions that will be explored in the course of the Talmudic passages that we're not going to be looking at. And among them, it will say, well, hang on a second, that's all very well if a person is praying for divine mercy. What about all the parts of our prayers in the Amidah? Well, we're not praying for mercy at all. We're simply praising God or saying thank you to God, or praying, on behalf of the whole Jewish nation or something like that. That may not be my own personal prayer for mercy for my circumstances. On Shabbat, for example, we don't pray for mercy. It's all thanksgiving and praise. So what does that mean in terms of Hebrew or English? Is that covered by the statement? Then there's another question which one might want to ask over here. Is there a distinction between a person who prays on their own or a person who is praying in a quorum with a minyan, with a community? Is there maybe a set fixed formula that the community have to observe in terms of, or can you, if you're davening with a minyan, can you also say it in any language which you want? None of these are made explicit in this highlighted statement over here, but is the subject matter that is discussed further down in the details of the Talmud. There is a very fascinating little statement over here that in which it says, but the Gemara asks, but may prayer really be prayed in any language? Didn't Rav Yehuda say a person should never make a request in the Aramaic language that his needs should be met? As Rabbi Yochanan said with regard to anyone who requests in the Aramaic language that his needs be met, the ministering angels do not attend to him because apparently the ministering angels are not familiar with the Aramaic language. What a fascinating piece of Talmud. First of all, why do we need ministering angels? Aren't we just davening directly to the Almighty? Do we need intermediaries in Judaism? And even if the angels do have some kind of role in our prayer, whatever these angels are, apparently they can't understand Aramaic. Do they question why not? And if they can't understand Aramaic, do they, by the way, understand English? Who taught them English? Is it only Aramaic they can't understand? And the Gemara continues, oh, this is not difficult. When you say we can pray in any language, and Rabbi Yehuda said, but not in Aramaic, it's not difficult. That statement that Rabbi Yochanan is referring to, when you're not allowed to pray in Aramaic, only refers to the prayer of an individual who needs the support of angels. Whereas the statement of the Mishnah, which says that you can pray in any language, including Aramaic, applies to communal prayer. So suddenly we're seeing the distinction over here between the individual and the communal, which we need to unpack and which we will come to in just a moment. By the way, Aramaic, of course, was the language that was spoken at that time, and it is the language of the Talmud. All of this stuff over here is all Aramaic. Aramaic was a sister language to Hebrew, very, very similar in its construct. And we do actually have some Aramaic pieces in our davening. Anybody know which ones they are, by the way? If you want to shout it out, but I'll tell you, the Kumpur Konmin Shemaya is in Aramaic.
Kaddish.
Pardon? Kaddish is in Aramaic. Brich Shmei Demara Alma, the prayer that we say when the ark is opened, is in Aramaic, which is one of the reasons why nobody can say these things, because they're tongue twisters. Okay. But, very fascinating. Okay. So Gemara continues to ask, well, hang on a second, these ministering angels, they're not familiar with Aramaic language, but isn't it taught in the Brighter that Yochanan the high priest heard a divine voice emerging from the house of the Holy of Holies that was saying, etc. So the Gemara goes on to say, but it seems that there was Aramaic and the angels could understand it. So that's as far as we need to go with the Talmud. Okay, I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to turn now to the second of our documents that I want to now turn to, and that is this one over here. Oops, we came back to the wrong one, I'm sorry. So let me go back to share screen and click on this and say share. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 15th century in Sfat takes all of the commentaries that have happened over the centuries, or all this stuff that has been written on these passages we've studied in the Talmud, and brings it to a halachic conclusion. And here is his conclusion in relation to the Shema. Yachol likrota b'chol lashon. A person can read it, the Shema, in any language. However, and this is not something which we saw in the Gemara, it was something which came out a little bit later in the Talmud, or came out in the commentaries, v'zaher midivrei shibush. One has to be careful to avoid word mispronunciations in that language, even if you are saying it in English. One has to be as precise in your pronunciation of the words in English as you would have been in the Holy Tongue in Hebrew. And there are, in the laws of Shema, there are warnings to be careful in Hebrew. A very famous one is the Lord Tizkuru. You shall not have the Tizkuru, and you shall remember them. And if you say Tizkuru instead of Tizkuru, Tizkuru means you shall profit by them. So sometimes a very small change of pronunciation can lead to a very different expression. I recall once, just when I was just out of yeshiva, and a companion and I had been asked to conduct a Yom Kippur service in Swaziland, of all places, and he was doing the davening. My companion was doing the davening. We were brand new Bale Teshuva, we didn't really have a hang of Hebrew, and he stood up and he shouted out at the top of his voice, instead of Uma Kochenu, and what is our strength, he said on Yom Kippur, he said, Uma Kohenu, and what are Kohanim about, which is just the difference between a hey and a chet, and it means something entirely different. At any rate, Shulchan Aruch has told us that you're allowed to recite the Shema in English, but you have to be careful to say the words accurately in English. And what about the question of attention to the words? Now, we didn't see anything about paying attention, kavanah, in the Gemara, but it is there. I just didn't take us into those passages. So, hakoret Shema, a person who reads the Shema, v'lo kiven libo b'pasuk rishon, and who does not pay attention, does not have kavanah in the first pasuk, Shema Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. If he doesn't at that time, as he's saying those words, have in mind that he means what he says, that I am accepting the oneness of God upon me, Lo Yatsa Yadei Chavato has not fulfilled his biblical obligation to recite the Shema that morning or that evening. Sha'ar, but in relation to the rest of the Shema, after that first line, in Lo Kiven Libo, if he has not paid any attention, as for the rest, or if he did not have the proper intention, and even if one was simply reciting the verses of the Shema from the Torah, or checking over those sections of text during the time that one is obligated to read the Shema, a sofer, for example, who's just checking the Sefer Torah and happens to be reading those passages at the time of the Shema, In this case, one has fulfilled his obligation as long as he had the intention to read the first verse. So it's the first verse of the Shema, which apparently is the most important. And after that, if you're reading without even recognizing, oh, I didn't know I was trying to fulfill the obligation to say the Shema this morning or this evening, that's fine. Let's look at the Amidah. That's what the Gemara said. You can pray in whatever language you like. However, along comes the Shulchan Aruch and adds in over here, the Hanimili, these words are b'tzibur, only apply in relation to the communal prayer. Aval b'yachid, if a person is praying on their own, lo yitpalel ele b'lashon hakadosh, then they have to pray only in Hebrew. V'yesh omrim, but there are other opinions that say the Hanimili, these words that say that when you're praying alone, you have to pray it in Hebrew, is only k'shasha'el tzorchav. It's only when he's asking for his needs. Kagon shitpalel al cholah, if he is praying for somebody who's ill, or al shum tsa'ar sheyesh lo bebeto, or he's praying for some kind of problem or pain that is happening in his or her home. Aval tefillah hakavua letzibur. But if this person is on their own and they're praying at the same time the prayer which hasn't been fixed for the community, like our Amidah is today, afilu yachid, even if that person is alone, yachol la'omra b'chol lashon, he can say it in any language. And there's a third opinion. V'yesh omrim da'af yachid, that even an individual, k'sheshoel tzorcho, when he's asking for his own needs, yachol lish'ol b'chol lashon sheyotzeh, is allowed to ask in any language which he wants, chutz min lashon Arami, except for Aramaic. Well, how'd you like that? 3 different opinions in this piece of Shulchan Aruch, just to keep us completely and totally confused. The first one is that you can pray in any language you like, but only if you are with the community, and if you're on your own, you have to pray in English. You have to pray in Hebrew. The second opinion is even if you're on your own, you can pray in any language you want, except if you're praying for those things which you need for a person who's ill or something like that, then that has to be in Hebrew. And the third is that, even if you're on your own and you're asking for things that are of your own needs, even then you can pray in any language you like, any language that you like. The only thing you can't do is you can't ask for your own needs in Aramaic, because it ain't going to get you anywhere. It's not going to work for some strange, mysterious reason that we're going to have to try and find the answer to. What about kavanah in the Amidah? We have seen that in the Shema, you have to have kavanah for the first verse of the Shema. If you don't have kavanah when you're saying all of that, apparently you have not fulfilled your biblical obligation to recite the Shema in the morning or in the evening twice a day, which of course comes from the passage of the Shema itself, that you shall say it in the morning, said when you rise up in the morning, when you lie down to go to sleep at night. So here is what the Shulchan Aruch wants to tell us about having intention in the Amidah. One who prays the Amidah needs to have the proper intent for all of the blessings. I don't know about you, but this is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, because lots of people, me included, actually find that their best thinking time is during the Amidah. You start off with the best of intentions, but somewhere along the line, all the bright ideas you have for the day pop into your mind. And before you know it, you've arrived at the end of the minute. You're taking it 3 steps back and you say, so goodness me, how did I get here? How did I arrive in this place? I don't remember saying a single thing in the middle. Nevertheless, says the Shulchan Aruch, the one who prays the Amidah needs to have the proper intent for all of the blessings, but if he is not able to concentrate on all of them, here's the out for people like us. He or she should at least concentrate on the blessing of the forefathers, the first blessing, Lekei Abraham, Lekei Yitzchak, Lekei Yaakov. The first blessing of the Amidah, also known as the Shemona Esrei. And if he didn't have the proper intent while saying the blessing of the forefathers, even if he has the right intent for the rest of the blessings, has to go back to the beginning of the Amidah, the Shmoneh Esrei, and pray again. That is what Rabbi Yosef Karo says. Okay. Now, hang on a second. Hold your hats on. Rabbi Yosef Karo is a Sephardi. He is living in Sfat in the 15th century. At the same time that he's writing his magnum opus that's going to change the Jewish world, the Shulchan Aruch, there is a great scholar living in Prague called Reb Moshe Isserles. And he too is working on a magnum opus of all the laws, with one fundamental difference. He is an Ashkenazi, so therefore he is going to write an opinion which is based upon the Ashkenazi sages, whereas Rav Moshe Karo, being a Sephardi, is going to rely predominantly upon the Maimonides, who had lived in the 12th century. Rav Moshe Isserles discovers at the very last moment, as he's about to publish his tremendous work, that it's already been done. That there's this dude back in Sfat, in the Galil, who's written a Shulchan Aruch. And now he's faced with the question, what should he do? He spent years and years and years slaving over this incredible work. And if he publishes it, it's going to create a massive split between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi communities. So with incredible humility, he drops his entire work, and all he does is he takes Joseph Karo's work, the Shulchan Aruch, and whenever there's a difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi practices and minhag, he simply inserts a gloss in Joseph Karo's Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes his glosses, which always reflect the Ashkenazi practice, will be more stringent, and sometimes they'll be more lenient. Look at his gloss now on this particular passage, where Yosef Karo has told us that you have to have intention in the first paragraph of the Shema, the first blessing, patriarchs. Says the Ramah, nowadays, you don't have to repeat the first paragraph if you didn't say it with intent, because there's a fair chance that when you say it the second time, you're still not going to have intent. You're going to mess it up again, because we're just not good enough to focus any longer, to be mindful. So why should you return? And one should not solely pray in his heart. So he continues. So that he says. So in other words, our practice is that of course you should try to have intention in the first paragraph of the Amidah, whether you're saying it in Hebrew or in English, because we've been already told you can say it in any language, depending on whether you're alone or not alone, etc. We'll come back to that. But if you didn't actually have intention, you don't have to repeat. And one should not solely pray in his heart, but one should rather enunciate the words with his lips and make it heard in his own ears, but not make it heard in general. The reason why you have to enunciate with your lips and be heard in your own ears is because that actually assists you in having concentration. That is why we recite the Amidah with words quietly, but not so quietly that you put off the person standing next to you because you're busy screaming it out and detracting that person from their intent. But you need to hear what you're saying. We need to fast forward to the 20th century because the Chofetz Chaim writes a very important new Shulchan Aruch, on Shulchan Aruch which builds on the old one, bringing all the practices up to date, and it's called the Mishnah Brura. And it is widely followed today as the authoritative final statement on the law. And he comes back to this question of whether you can daven in any language if you want, which it seems up until this point over here, and everything which we've learned, that the Talmud has told us that we can recite the Shema in any language which we want. The Gemara you can certainly recite in any language in which you want. We have seen some kind of distinction between a person who davens privately and with the community in the quorum, with the minyan. We've also seen a distinction about the nature of the prayer if you're praying privately, whether it should be a prayer for help or just more our formed prayer. The Mishnah Berurah now comes along and says on these words, B'chol lashon. I only have this in Hebrew over here, but it's not difficult. You can pray in any language. And now he comes back to the question over here, which arose first in the Gemara, and in that very interesting difference of language between the version of Rashi and the version of Tosafot, as to whether you can pray in any language, which doesn't tell you whether you have to understand the language, or whether you have to pray only in a language that you understand. And he tells us quite categorically that if you're going to pray in a language other than Hebrew, v'davka shemevin ba'oto halashon, it is only if that language, if you understand that language. So bad luck, you can't pray in Persian. If you want to pray in another language, it has to be the language that you understand. And then he says, by the way, this is not just about the Shema, which is what happens to be commenting on in this chapter 62:3. V'hu adin b'tefillah, and the same thing applies to the tefillah, which means the Amidah. And remember, we saw Birkat Hamazon, which we've not been going in today. The same thing applies to Birkat Hamazon, which means that you can actually say Birkat Hamazon, benching in English, but you have to understand the language. And then he goes on to say, HaMitzvot, v'chol zeh mitzad hadin. All of that is in relation to the strict law. Aval mitzvah min hamuvchar, but the preferred way to perform the mitzvah of prayer, hu dafka b'lashon hakodesh, is only in the holy tongue. The preference has to be for Hebrew. You may be permitted to say it in English, in the language or any language that you understand, but the preference, the best way, mitzvah min hamucha, means the choicest way to perform this mitzvah is in Lashon HaKodesh. And so it is written by one of the earlier commentaries, the Bach, had his name in my mind a few moments ago. I'll come back to it. I just can't remember his name. The iron, okay, yeah. And the reason for this is the b'yameinu, in our days, af mitzad hadin, even according to the strict law, yesh lizaher, one should be careful, shelo likrota b'lashon acher, one should, even in our days, meaning to say, even in a time when he knows that many people can't read Hebrew accurately, he said, even in our days, it's still better to read it in Hebrew, ki im b'lashon hakodesh, only in the holy tongue, ki yesh kama v'chama tevot, because there are many, and his reason, why does he want us to read it in Hebrew? Because yesh kama v'chama tevot, because there are many, many words, she'ein anu yodim eich la'atikam hetev, that we don't know how to translate properly. Kagon, tevat v'shinantam, for example, the word in the Shema, v'shinantam, which we translate as, and you shall teach. But when you look at Rashi, etc., you'll see that the word can also mean that you have to be sharp in your understanding of Torah. And there are many other explanations that and translations that we simply don't have accurately. So his argument is that if you're not davening in Hebrew and you're davening in a language of translation, you've got no idea whether you're being accurate to the prayer any longer. You don't know whether you're saying the right thing because we don't know how to translate all of the words. That's the problem with translation. And he says, so it applies to Lashon HaKetzer. Okay. So let's turn now to an article by Moshe Eberman, praying in a language other than Hebrew. It's a Rosh Yeshiva in Gush. And I have significantly cut down his article to make it, to just get to the parts we want. If we argue that prayer requires understanding, then we have to clarify the following. Does this requirement apply only when one is praying in a foreign language? Or perhaps even if one is praying in Hebrew? Must a person praying in Hebrew even understand what they're saying? The generally accepted rule is that when a person prays in a language other than Hebrew, he must understand the words issuing from his mouth. As for prayer in Hebrew, some of the poskim do require us to understand it, but there are those who disagree. And so regarding this point, an additional question arises. Assuming that we rely on the position that person discharges his obligation with Hebrew prayer, even without understanding the words, is it then preferable to recite the blessings in Hebrew and not understand them? Or is it better for us to pray in a language which we do understand? And again, this comes back to the question of content versus formula. Which one is more important? Rishonim, the Acharonim, the early and the latter sages address this issue, and they say there are four considerations over here. The importance of a person understanding the blessings that he's reciting. How important is that? The level of holiness in the very recitation of reading in Hebrew. Their concern was that one of the innovations instituted by the Reform movement was prayer in the vernacular. And this caused some of the halachic authorities to forbid the practice. That is not something which Orthodox Jews do. That's what's one of the things that distinguishes us between us and Reform. And there's also this hugely important factor, which was in the minds of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly, at the time of the Second Temple, when they had seen for the first time that there was possibility of exile and the people had come back after 70 years, had lost the plot, and they were no longer able to read Hebrew, they just lost the sense of continuity. And it was they who established the Amidah, and they saw that as a way to keep together the unity of the nation. It's important that when a person prays, they should be praying the same words recited by other Jews across the world, possibly. And the fact that might provide prayer with a dimension of unity and partnership amongst all the members of the Jewish people. And that is something which we all feel in the modern day when you go traveling around, you land up in another shul, provided it's not some kind of crazy Sephardi shul somewhere in, in Rome or somewhere Italian Sephardim who have very different traditions, but you go wherever you go in the world, you walk into a shul, you pick up a siddur, you've got the same prayers, it's the same vishamru, sometimes the tunes are the same. It's fantastic. It's all because we pray in Hebrew. So what are you doing when you start to pray in English? You're breaking all of this. Let's take a look at the importance of understanding the words. Okay, let's jump into this and get a better idea of some of these issues over here. The Magen Avraham is one of the very important codifiers, commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. He says it's written in a certain book that it's preferable to pray in a language that a person understands if he does not understand Hebrew, and that is also written in the book called Sefer Hasidim, and the Magen Avraham brings the name of Sefer Hasidim, that understanding is actually the most important factor. A person must pray in a language which he understands. This, of course, is against those who are going to tell us in a moment that the important thing is to pray in Lashon HaKadosh for all the reasons that we are going to see. So says the Sefer Hasidim, if you're approached by a person who does not understand Hebrew and he fears is a God-fearing person and he wishes to have proper thoughts, or if you're approached by a woman, the presumption in those days was that a woman couldn't read Hebrew. These days, of course, women are more learned than men, so ignore the statement over here. If a rabbi is approached by somebody who doesn't understand Hebrew, says the Sefer Hasidim, tell them they should learn the prayers in any language which they understand, because prayer is nothing but the understanding of the heart. And if a heart does not understand what the mouth is saying, how will it help him? And therefore it is preferable to pray in a language he understands. And he goes on to say and follows. In contrast, many authorities have argued that understanding prayer is actually not of critical importance. The Yad Ephraim raises the question whether it is at all possible to render prayer in a correct and faithful translation. That's what we saw in the Mishnah Brura. Other Acharonim, the Chafetz Chaim, who have just seen, that say that that the words of the Sefer Hasidim that he says, it's really important for you to understand what you're saying. They say, well, actually, that only applied in his time. That was at a time when people were more elevated, and when they offered their prayers, they knew what they were saying. They were at a much higher level. Today, when only a small minority of people pray with proper thoughts and concentration, what the Sefer Hasidim says is totally irrelevant. Much better to pray in Hebrew, because the idea that prayer is about understanding what you're saying and the intention of the heart doesn't apply to us anymore. We're just not there. So better say it in Hebrew, even if you don't understand it. That's the counter argument. And what are the advantages of praying in Hebrew? So a second argument mentioned by the poskim is that even if we assume that it's of great importance for a person to understand his prayers, the advantages of praying in Hebrew overcome this consideration. Ovadia Yosef, of course, was a great posek, and he was the Sephardi chief rabbi, discusses this issue at length in one of his works and quotes lots of authorities. One of the most important arguments is that prayer was instituted in Hebrew, and it contains thoughts and ideas that do not lend themselves to translation in another language. We've already seen this argument. And the more fundamental position is actually rules out completely prayer at non-Hebrew prayer at all times. The Aruch HaShulchan, another more contemporary posek, says one who examines the Gemara will see that it is not referring to the fixed prayer established by the men of the Knesset HaGedolah. In other words, this whole discussion back in the Gemara when it says a person can pray in any language they want, they're not talking about the Amidah that we have today. The Amidah, the fixed prayer that was established by the men of the Knesset, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, is fixed for all time. Who would dare to change the words that stand at the height of the world into another language? He goes so far as to say, whoever prays in another language and prays the Amidah in another language performs an act of wickedness. So the Aruch HaShulchan absolutely forbids non-Hebrew prayer, with the exception of a few extreme cases. Let's finally take a look at the question of private versus congregational prayer, and then we're going to bring it all together and sum up after all of these arguments going both ways. Even if we assume that prayers may be recited in vernacular, in what framework may this be done? The Gemara distinguished between an individual and a congregation, and it also asserted that an individual was forbidden to pray in Aramaic. Remember all that funny business about the angels that don't understand Aramaic? An individual requires the assistance of the ministering angels, whereas a congregation does not require the same. Apparently, congregational prayer reaches God directly without mediation of the angels, and therefore there's no problem for communal prayer to be conducted in another language. But when a person prays on their own, it doesn't have the same efficacy, it's not as powerful. And we need a little bit of help to take our tefillot up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the angels come and they carry your tefillah and they take it up and they bring it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, look, here is the prayer of this lovely person, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm bringing it to you as a gift from down below. And we need the angels. The problem is they don't do it with Aramaic. They only do it with other languages for reasons which we'll see. Maimonides writes as follows. Congregational prayers always heard by the Almighty. Even if there are sinners among them, the Holy One, blessed be He, does not reject the prayer of a multitude. And therefore, a person should always associate himself or herself with the congregation and never recite their prayers in private when they're able to pray with the congregation. That is why you have some Meshuggahs who go rushing off to shul at the crack of dawn every morning to pray with a minyan. Okay? One should always attend synagogue morning and evening, for only if recited in the synagogue are one's prayers heard at all times. Whoever has a synagogue in his town and does not worship there is called a bad neighbor. I don't want to make any comment about the membership of South Hampstead. We shall move on swiftly. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, very fascinating, has suggested, he's a great expert in Maimonides and the nuances in Maimonides' language. The superfluous sentence in the Rambam. Hence, a person should associate himself with the congregation and never recite his prayers in private. When he's able to pray with the congregation, refers to the prayer of an individual that is recited at the same time the congregation is engaged in prayer, which is also considered association with the congregation. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. What an insight. Says Rav Soloveitchik, the Rav. that if a person is davening on their own, but they're davening at the same time as the community, 7:15 in the morning for Shachrit, it is considered as if they are davening with the minyan. That's the way he reads Maimonides. Now, that's a great out. Yeah, that's a man who you want to pay to give a psak. Okay, makes life a lot easier. And thus it follows that a fixed framework for prayer in other languages should not be established with respect to a one-time occurrence. However, it seems this is the conclusion that we have here from the author. A fixed framework for prayer in other languages should not be established with respect to one-time occurrences. However, it seems that one may rely on those opinions that allow congregational prayer in other languages, and this is particularly true when, from an educational perspective, it is important to conduct prayers in the vernacular. For example, when the congregation will not understand anything that the prayers are conducted in Hebrew. As for an individual, it seems on a temporary basis, a person may pray in another language when the objective is to quickly learn the language of prayer and to move over to Hebrew prayer. Just come back to the business of because it wasn't covered over here in the part of this article that I kept and didn't edit out. The business about Aramaic. The reason apparently why the angels don't like Aramaic is because it's a bastard language. It's a distortion of Hebrew. And therefore they don't buy into it. They could easily, of course, understand it, because anybody who can understand Hebrew could understand Aramaic. But this business in the Talmud about them not taking up the prayers of the individual which are prayed in Aramaic is because they don't rate Aramaic as a language, despite the fact that it was okay. Yep.
That question about praying at the same time as the congregation. I tend to, I'm a bit more of an early riser and I like to pray a bit earlier. Is that so terrible? And part B, when I joined the Shia, you seem to have already davened as well, kind of sitting through it as I am.
Yeah, we don't have a minyan at the moment, so there's no communal, formal communal prayer. There's no minyan. We have a get together, but it's not a prayer service.
Okay.
The answer is if for whatever reason you're davening earlier, of course, but if you can, you should daven the Amida at the same time as the community would be.
Right.
So look, where we've arrived at over here is that it seems perfectly clear there's some very strong opinions in the Talmud through all of the commentaries, etc., that there is a basis for praying in English. Even the Shema, even the Amidah, there's an issue relating to having kavanah, but we've overcome that because we say we just don't have that level of it. But there's another argument over here that there's something special about Lashon HaKodesh, and both in terms of the unity of the people, the fact that you can't translate the prayers accurately into English, and the whole question about whether you actually need to have any understanding what you're saying. So you've got arguments really on both sides over here, and it looks indecisive in terms of a conclusion. So I offer from this the following guidelines and conclusions. My summary. These are my words now, not the summary of the author of the article. One may recite the Shema in his own language, provided that he enunciates the words clearly and articulately, and that follows the majority of the sages in the Talmud, where it was only Rabbi Yehuda Nasi who said that the Shema is to be in Hebrew. All agree that the Amidah can be recited in any language. However, having said all of that, Hebrew is the language of choice for prayers. Hebrew is the language of, sorry for the repetition, but prayer requires understanding as well. So if you understand the meaning of the words you're saying, then pray in Hebrew. If you don't, pray in the language that you understand until you learn Hebrew. But let me qualify this, because the words I've put over here, understand the meaning of the words, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to understand the meaning of every word. It means you need to have a general understanding of what you're saying. So for example, If you take the green Siddur, or the art scroll for that matter, and you are trying to say the Amidah in Hebrew, while you may not understand every single word you're reading, if you cast your eye across to the left and look at the heading of each paragraph, you'll see the overall content of that paragraph. So, patriarchs, you'll know that that first paragraph is positioning yourself as connected with our heritage, with Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov. If you look at the next paragraph and you see a little heading which says might, Gevura, you know that those words are going to be speaking about you're praising God's might. The third one is holiness, you're praising God's holiness. Then as you go through, you'll see the paragraph is about healing. And you'll know the content of those words, even though you don't understand all of them, is I'm praying to God for healing, for refuah, for me and for everyone else. The paragraph about parnasa, barech aleinu hashana hazot, give us all, it's put in agricultural terms, everything which you need, rain and everything else, but you're asking for parnasa for the world. So long as you know that that's what I'm asking for, you don't need to understand each individual word. Similarly, in relation to the Shema, who amongst us joining us today does not know what the overall content is of the first line of the Shema, certainly, and at least the first paragraph of the Shema? Even though, if I ask you to translate it word by word, you may not be able to do that. But you know what it says. So therefore, although you're saying it in Hebrew, you're saying it in Hebrew in a way that you understand what you're saying. Because there is a yediyah klali, a general understanding, as opposed to a particular understanding, a word for word understanding. And that general understanding takes us a very long way. And so the same thing could apply to all the rest of prayer as well. So long as you've read through that English paragraph on another occasion or prayed in it, etc., and you know what it is saying in overall terms, then it's absolutely fine to be consistent with both hedging your bets, saying it in Hebrew because it's formalistic, because the words have holiness, because it's the original words, because it unifies us with everybody else in the world, and all the other arguments, while at the same time, you are also meeting the requirement to be mindful and aware of the things you're saying. What is more problematic is somebody who day in and day out rattles through all the prayers, says in the Hebrew, either accurately or inaccurately, has got no clue whatsoever about what's saying. We then find ourselves in this great big debate, which is more important, the words in Hebrew or intention of the heart and understanding what you're saying, which seems intuitively to be part of what prayer must be. Certainly, when one is asking for things from God, one would want to understand what one is asking for. Otherwise, it feels kind of like meaningless. So there is a way to bridge these two views that have emerged in this great debate throughout all the centuries. And I suggest to you that we can actually manage it quite well, and that most of us actually do manage it quite well. But I think that most people will find that praying in English, actually, certainly communally, as opposed to individually, actually doesn't really work. Doesn't feel like the right thing. And that somehow, when you say it in Hebrew, even though you know the majority of people don't know what each word means, it just feels right. It's the language of the soul. It's the language of our people. It's the language of the sages. There's something very special about davening in Hebrew, but much better if we can understand what we're saying as well. That is my total offering for the day. I apologize if it falls short of your expectations, but there we are.
No, that was great.
Questions? I'm happy to take them. Everybody's remained suspiciously
silent. What about when you have a rough idea of what prayer means, because we can see the English, but you don't want to pray for that? I have a real problem with where we want all the who is it, slanderers, all to be exterminated. I don't want to pray for that. I mean, sure, they might get over the slandering and repent.
It's very, very fascinating. This was a great big debate, as Lindy will know, because we both just read a book on the fascinating book on the subject. But it was a great big debate in Yavne. Yavne was where the sages regrouped after the destruction of the temple. And that's the time of the great sages, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar, all the ones we read about in the Haggadah. The old circus, by the way, that's the name of the person who is the Bach. His name just came back to me. The Rabbi Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time. And there was a great, great, great big debate. It was the early days of Christianity. And the Christians in those days were Jews. And there was a question about what do we do with them? Do you exclude them, push them out, in which case there's every possibility that you'll create a massive, massive split in Judaism? Or are you makar them? Do you bring them in? Do you actually engage them, etc.? And just recognize that they're on a slightly different track, but there's got to be rooms for, etc. And the arguments were, some argued that you should know that they may be your friends now, but this is not going to turn out well. You bring them in. This is not a story that's going to turn out well for the Jewish people down the line, you know. And others said, no. He said we need to keep them engaged. And they had to find. It was a huge debate. I mean, it was absolutely, the sages were adamant about it. I mean, they were at each other's throats on the whole issue. It was really one of the arguments of the time. At the time when they were formulating these prayers, these 19 prayers, and there was a sense that this whole business, the people who then became known as slanderers and heretics, etc., were going to undermine and create a huge problem for the Jewish people, and they could not be included in the Jewish community. And that there needed to be some message given to the people as we were formulating these prayers that we needed to exclude them. And those who wanted to exclude, Rabbi Gamliel, etc., won the argument, and they formulated this particular prayer for all of those people throughout all the ages, starting then, who have made our lives an absolute misery. They just coded it in the language of slanderers. So we're talking over here, Leslie, about our worst enemies who have really, really given us a lot of stick over the course of the centuries. That's who that particular prayer was directed at. Can't help it. If you don't like it, I can't help you. But that's its history.
No, I have a question, please.
Yes.
When you're saying, like you're saying, the refuah shlema within the Amida, I don't know if people know all the Hebrew names of the people that they are praying for. So is that all right to say the part in Jewish, but then move into the English name?
Yes.
Because is that okay?
Yes. Even better if you can picture them in your mind.
Fine, can do that one.
Yeah.
Okay, because otherwise it lead to a lot of problems.
You don't have to say names. You can picture them in your mind. That works as well, I believe.
Even just, okay.
Well, let's just imagine if God can't read our thoughts, then we have a fundamental problem with standing up and speaking to him.
Right. Very good, thank you.
Shlomo, sometimes I read some of it in English to remind myself, and most days I read it in Hebrew, but some days I look across and read the English so that I'm reminded of what I am saying.
Sounds like you're doing the right thing, Lenny. Good on you. It's good to remind ourselves from time to time. If you take a bit more time, you can look at the English and then come back to the Hebrew, but that's doubles up on time. All right.
Shlomo,
Yeah.
I appreciated your comment which is that you have all your best thoughts when you're davening.
Yes.
Right? And I must confess, exactly the same situation, right? Two interesting observations, right? The first one is that my brain doesn't tend to multitask in the same way when I'm davening with a congregation for some reason.
Right.
More significantly, if you ever try, and I often, read particularly the first part of the service, the Psalms, etc. When you read them in English, it's very difficult to multitask once you're reading in English. When you're
Yes.
reading in Hebrew, it becomes like almost singing a song, and your brain's singing the song, and the other part of your brain is doing some creative thinking.
Yeah, indeed. I agree. By the way, they tell a story of the rabbi goes up to one of his congregants at the end of Shacharit and says to him, Shalom Aleichem, wishes him Shalom Aleichem. So the man's a bit surprised, he's a bit Rebbe. He said, I thought you only said Shalom Aleichem to somebody if you haven't seen them for 3 days. They've been on a journey for 3 days. He said, why are you saying Shalom Aleichem to me? He says, where your head has been during davening, during Shacharit is more than 3 days journey. All right, everyone.